As the witching hour approaches, we find ourselves in the heart of frozen isolation. Snow blankets every inch of this remote corner of the English countryside, and each gust of wind whispers secrets of times long ago, the only sound other than the crunching of snow beneath your weary feet. But then, a mysterious shadow appears on the horizon, for here, in the middle of nowhere, lies the path of the phantom coach. Terri Lynne Hudson tells the story by Amelia Edwards. Pull your blanket tight and listen close, travelers. It is now that your journey begins.
It was just 20 years ago, and I had been out all day hunting with no sport to speak of, and I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm fluttering down, and the evening closing in. Not the faintest sign of life met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing to do but walk on and take my chance of finding shelter. The snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. The cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. My heart grew heavy as I thought of my young wife watching for me through the window, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. This morning, when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. Even now, weary as I was, I felt I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shouts seemed only to make the silence deeper. I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. A wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. "Thank God," was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" he growled. "Well, for you. I've been lost in the snow. How far am I now from Dwalding?" "A good 20 miles, more or less." "And the nearest village?" "The nearest village is about 12 miles the other direction." "Where do you live, then? Please, let me go with you." The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. "'Tain't no use," he growled. "The master won't let you in." "Who is the master?" The gnome-like man was hobbling away through the falling snow. "You lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter." You can try him," muttered my reluctant guide. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. Once inside, I found myself in a great raftered hall. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural tools, casks, and all kinds of lumber, while overhead hung hams, baskets, and bunches of dried herbs. In the center of the floor stood some huge object gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth, and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw a telescope of very considerable size, mounted on a rude, movable platform with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned, the speculum at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you," said my guide, with a malicious grin. He pointed to a low, black door at the opposite of the hall. I crossed over and went in, without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white-haired old man rose from a table, covered with books and papers, and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" said he. "What do you want?" I told him I simply sought sustenance and sleep. "Jacob, how dare you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," mumbled the old man. "He followed me and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". "By what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same that gives the right to cling to your boat when drowning. Self-preservation." "Self-preservation?" "The snow would cover my body before daybreak." The man strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay till morning." With this, he waved me to a seat and resumed his studies. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. The room was carpetless. The walls were scrolled over with strange diagrams and covered with crowded shelves of philosophical instruments. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase. On the other, a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-open door of a cupboard at the further end of the room, I saw geological specimens, crucibles, and jars of chemicals, while on the shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps and papers. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of sherry were placed before me. "I have little to offer you, sir," said my host. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for our deficiencies." I protested, with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman, that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He sat down to his own supper, which consisted of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when we had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and, turning abruptly towards me, said, Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of the outer world?" I encouraged his interrogation, and he bent his head in acknowledgement, leaned forward, with his elbows resting on his knees and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, but I was no student of science. I was much relieved when he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. I listened, spellbound. I had never heard anything like it then. I have never heard anything like it since. He poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and, still leaning forward in the same moody attitude, with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation. Like an inspired dreamer, he spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, of those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, specters, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. "The world," he said, "rejects as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory. Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimony so wide and so various as the belief in apparitions, attested by all races of men, in all ages and in all climates, by the Christian, the pagan. This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by philosophers. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool." He relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands and added, "I was branded a visionary, ridiculed by my contemporaries, and banished from the field I'd given all the best years of my life. Since then, I have lived as you see me now. The world has forgotten me, and I have forgotten the world." He rose, as if desirous of ending the conversation, and went over to the window. "It has ceased snowing," he observed, as he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. "Oh, if it were only possible," I said. "But even if I could find my way, I could not walk 20 miles tonight." "Tonight?" repeated my host. "Are you so very anxious? What are you thinking of?" "Of my wife," I replied impatiently, "who does not know that I have lost my way." "Where is she?" "At Dwalding, 20 miles away." "Dwalding," he echoed, thoughtfully. "Yes, that's 20 miles. Then he smiled. "The night mail from the north changes horses at Dwalding. They pass within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you, you could find your way, I suppose?" "Easily, gladly." He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, and, taking a bottle of whiskey and a wine-glass from the cupboard in which he kept his chemicals, said, "The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking tonight. I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like liquid flame, and almost took my breath away. "It is strong," he said, "but it will help to keep out the cold. And now you have no moments to spare. Good night." I thanked him for his hospitality and would have shaken hands, but he had turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute, Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out in the bitter cold. Not a star glimmered, not a sound, save the crunching beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob shambled on in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand and his shadow at his feet. I followed, gun over my shoulder. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears and held my imagination captive. I strode on at the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. "Yon's the old coach road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand." "And how far do I go before the crossroads?" "About 3 miles. It's a fair enough road for foot passengers, but too steep and narrow for traffic. Mind where the wall is broken away near the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident." "What accident?" "The night mail pitched right over into the valley below, 50 feet or so. 4 were found dead, and the other 2 died the next morning." "How long is it since this happened?" "Just 9 years. "Near the signpost, you say? I will bear it in mind. Good night." I tipped the man, and he thanked me before trudging back the way we came. I watched his lantern till the light disappeared, and then turned to pursue my way alone. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to. A strange sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head and accumulated them at compound interest. Meanwhile, the night became colder, and even though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. I even breathed with difficulty, as though I was scaling the heights of some mountain. I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did, I chanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant light. It must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seems strange that any private vehicle should take a road professedly disused and dangerous. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads by mistake, and that this was the very coach I had come to meet? It came round the bend of the road, wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out, like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The coachman pulled up. The guard neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travelers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, and slipped into the vacant corner. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. I looked at my fellow passengers, all 3 men, and all silent. Each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle, as if absorbed in his own reflections. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and, turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I lost patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew. Now I saw that every part of the coach was in a condition of decay, crusted over with mold, and literally rotting. I turned to the third passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and he moved his head slowly and looked me in the face, without speaking a word. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid, and his bloodless lips were drawn back as if in agony, showing gleaming teeth between. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a dreadful horror came upon me. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He too was looking at me, with the same pallor in his face and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own, and saw that he was no living man. None of them were living men. Pale light played upon their awful faces, upon their hair dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were as the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy, burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. I awoke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by landing upon a deep snowdrift. I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds, who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to aid my broken arm and fractured skull. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events, but she treated the adventure as a mere dream, born of the fever in my brain. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago, I was the fourth inside passenger in that phantom coach.